All right. So tonight's topic is going to be difficult relationships. You know, when you're having a study of relationships, at some point you're going to have to circle around to this topic. Because when we're dealing with people relationships, that's two human beings involved, and the odds of something going wrong in the relationship are pretty high. We're not really talking about the relationship like if you're not getting along with your friend anymore or your spouse or anything like that. We'll deal with some stuff like that a little bit later on down the line. The type of relationship that we're going to be dealing with tonight is relationships to people at large. Sometimes difficulty occurs in these types of relationships. The Bible actually has a little bit to say about that. So, difficult relationships are an inevitable part of life. As Christians, some difficulties will be caused by our faith. Basically, somebody's not going to like it at some point. You're going to encounter that. And so how should we conduct ourselves when this happens? That's going to be the thing that we're looking for here. It is a given it will happen. How do we react to it? So that's what we're really going to focus on, part of it. Administrative note, I did create the file on my Google Drive that has all of my notes in it, and I sent out invites to that. If you sent me an email, check it and see if you got it. If you didn't, let me know, but that's still open. If you want the PowerPoints, which are basically my outlines, you can get them there. Or you can wait till the class is over and I'll email them to you. So, a relationship is the way in which one or more concepts, objects, or people are connected. We are interested in the people part of that. The others are good studies and science and things like that, but we're interested in the people part. Relationships are vital to us. They affect our physical well-being, our spiritual, mental, emotional well-being. And the idea of trying to have no relationships at all it'll kill you. It'll make your life a lot shorter, trying to isolate ourselves like that. Relationships can be rewarding, exhausting, painful, 2 out of 3, 3 out of 3, all at the same time. And so one of the things that we have to learn as human beings, and especially as Christians, is how to take proper care of our relationships. Some principles that we've looked at so far: love God and one another, treat one another well, appreciate one another, edify, build up one another, and empathize with one another. Now, these things ought to be really obvious, but you would be amazed at how often they are not practiced, in the world at large. So for us, this is part of what we do for each other. I did mention this. There's like 48 or 49 times in the New Testament where the Bible talks about something that you and I should specifically do for one another. Relationships can be strained when we don't share important interests or goals. And our relationships as Christians are based on a common hope and a common faith. We have a lot in common with each other, and that should allow us to build good relationships with each other because of this. 4 aspects of relationships that all relationships share are compatibility, cooperation, intimacy, and emotional support. And the degree that you will share this with the people in your relationship is really kind of based upon the relationship. You probably are more compatible, cooperative, intimate, and emotionally supportive of a friend than you are the general public at large, more so with your family, and then even more so with your spouse. But being amongst us as brothers and sisters, we need to practice and develop these things just with each other. It's the differences between us, though, that make the relationship valuable, rewarding, and fun. 2 people are not identical. There's different perspectives, there's different experiences, there's different gifts, there's even different personalities in there. And it's the sharing of these things that helps build the relationship. And it's that helps grow us individually and in that particular relationship. Okay, any questions or comments before we get into our topic? Okay, let's turn in our Bibles to Matthew chapter 5, and I'd like to volunteer to read verses 38 through 48 for us, please. Who? Oh, yes, go ahead.
I'll be reading from the New American Standard. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evil person. But whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, let him have your coat also. Whoever forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to him who asks of you, and do not turn away from him who wants to borrow from you. You've heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? If you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing more than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? Therefore, you are to be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect.
Okay. If you look at the beginning of the passage, it says, you have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. In ancient times, this was a very radical concept. This was actually the beginning of recorded human law. Moses was not the only person to come up with this. In the Code of Hammurabi, in ancient history, they tried to codify, if you did this, this was going to be the punishment. And why would they do this, both in biblical sense and, in civil law? It's because we tend to go nuts taking our own vengeance. It's really what it boils down to. You call me a name, I shoot you in the face. Your family resents it, and they shoot my whole family in the face, and then then it goes downhill from there. But so Bible's codifying it here. Make the punishment fit the crime. Code of Hammurabi tried to do that too, and it was a lot more violent than what the Bible has to say about it. You steal a loaf of bread, you get your hand cut off. You only get to do that twice, right? So, but it was at least an effort to do this. And so, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is teaching this different principle of do not resist him who is evil, and it's illustrated by 3 acts. A slap on the cheek, an unjust lawsuit, and a forced burden. So, probably need to talk about that idea of, I think, if they compel you to go a mile, go 2 with them. Under Roman law, a Roman citizen or a Roman soldier, I don't remember which one, could compel somebody who was a non-Roman to carry their burden for a mile along any Roman highway, mile marker to mile marker. And they didn't particularly care whether it was convenient for you or not. You're up to other things, and you could do that. They could compel you to do that. But they all 3 have this in common with them. Number 1, they're not fatal, but they are humiliating. Why slap somebody on the cheek? Well, it's to show a sign of dominance, a dislike, or something like that. It's a humiliating experience. This is something that I can do to you that you can't do anything about. The lawsuit's the same way when he says, if they take your shirt, give them your coat also. And then with the mile, give them another mile on here. So what Christ is advocating in this is he's advocating that we respond in an unexpected way. So you slap somebody in the cheek or get slapped in the cheek, what's the most common way to react there? We're either going to want to slap them back, or we're going to be, irritated, hostile, or something like that. There is no smile into that. And yet here he's saying, turn the other cheek. When somebody takes your shirt in an unjust or even a just lawsuit, when they take this from you, you're irritated. That's my favorite shirt or what have you. Do something, give them something extra. When they make you go that mile carrying that 60-pound burden, things like that, go too. That reflects the way Christ would respond. This is what he's teaching there. And the other thing it does, it actually gives us some control in the situation. We are choosing how to respond rather than reacting. And anybody who has slapped the cheek or taken your shirt or caused you to go a mile would be a little bit shocked on that, because part of their reward usually is the fact that you don't like it. So now they have to, there's something there. It's at least a curiosity for them to think about. Questions or comments? There's a fourth injustice in this verse, though, in this passage, and it begins in verse 43, and this is outrage against us. This is persecution. Persecution can be more than just humiliation. It can be an immediate threat because of our faith. Typically, persecution will go through a cycle. It will begin with maybe a form of ostracism, like ridicule or marginalizing or anything like that. You're all a bunch of weird people and you got these funny beliefs and nobody really likes you very well. And then it starts to get ramped up a little bit after that. We're not going to associate with those people. We're not going to do business with those people. We're not going to hire those people or pay bills to those people or do business of any kind with those people. And then it can ramp up then to where we get into the more violent and punitive forms of persecution. And for us, persecution is nearly always based upon our faith. Now, that's not the only reasons, human beings persecute other human beings, but from the perspective of what Christ is talking about here, this is why we're going to get persecuted here. And so, again, the response given in verses 44 through 48 is the opposite of what the persecution intends to produce. Persecution is intended to be a form of coercion. And it really wants to operate in terms of an immediate threat. So, we say we believe in God, we believe that we have a common hope, a home in heaven, and all these kinds of things. When you're staring down a barrel of hate or, in a physically life-threatening situation, the very immediate threat in that context is the persecution. How well do you believe in what your hope is then? That's now the rubber's hitting the road. And the thing that is important in the first century when the Romans did this to the church is I'm reasonably certain that not everybody, successfully resisted the persecution. That's what human nature is. But a lot of them did. And the Romans found that noteworthy, that they couldn't even bully and murder these people to the point that they would deny this thing that they believed in. Now, hopefully we don't get to that particular point, but, it could happen. And, the response that Christ is telling them to do in verses 44 through 48 is his love. It reflects his love for everyone, including his persecutors. The people who put him on the cross, cried out, "Crucify him," could have been forgiven for that if they chose to follow Christ. Did any of them? I don't know. But he died for that sin. The people who nailed the hands to the cross could have been forgiven, because that's what Christ came to do. That was his goal. His perspective was the eternal perspective. And I think that that's part of what we have to take from this in dealing with that particular aspect. That's an extreme. We can talk about what's going, how we would handle that and still fail at the smaller things, the turning of the cheek and all of that kind of a thing. So, any questions or comments?
Hey, John.
Yes.
I think Romans chapter 12 kind of parallels what you're talking about, where he talks about loving your enemy. And the writer also says that vengeance is mine. Love your enemies, feed your enemy, I'll take care of it.
Yeah, I'll bet we see that tonight.
Sorry.
That's okay. That's a natural thing. When I was studying for this thing, that's like the first thing I thought of too. So, how should we respond? Well, number one, accept that the world is unfair. It is. You're not always going to get your way. You might get into trouble for something that you didn't really do. I think I might have done that once. But, for the most part, things are unfair. That's the way the world works there. Turning the other cheek is an active choice. Don't make them move. You turn the other cheek. That's an active choice. Do not retaliate. Get our feelings under control. Persecution will happen. And this last bullet point, I want to throw this in here, is for the things that we would find humiliating or something like that, it is possible that could go beyond that to something that is physically, financially, emotionally harmful according to civil law. And if that occurs, you can use legal means for redress. This is not denying that, because the things like turning the cheek and giving up your coat, walking the extra mile, those aren't really necessarily harmful, they're humiliating, but they're not necessarily illegal. Although I think if you slap somebody in our country, that is a form of assault, but you're probably not going to do 36 years in a maximum security prison for it. Josh?
The way that I look at it, because there's other examples in Scripture of people saying no thank you in certain ways. Paul, whenever he was imprisoned, he was able to use legal means for handling things. Turning the other cheek was not, for Paul, like a physical turning the other cheek. It was an acknowledgement of where he was. The way I look at all of this is changing the default way that we look at how we handle interactions with people. Is the default, I'm going to punch you in the face, or is the default, I'm going to look for a way that I can get through this peaceably? And I think that's really at least for me, my understanding.
Yeah, I think that's a good understanding of it. It's basically not reacting the way that we want to react as a human being. Any other thoughts, comments? So, in Matthew 5:39 through 42, 3 unexpected responses. Turn the other cheek. If they slap the left one, let them slap the right one. They're not expecting that, and you're still actually in control of the situation. You might want to get that. Give them your coat, and which is give them something they did not ask for. They already got your shirt. Give them your coat. Not a good deal in the wintertime, but that's the idea of it. Is again something they're not expecting, and go the extra mile. Carry the burden another mile. Probably won't like it either, but I also want you to note the absence of any accusation or acknowledgement of humiliation or hurt. Christ doesn't deal with the attitude there. He doesn't say, don't act all mopey and do this, and things, just do it. Don't worry about the humiliation, just do this thing, and show them something different, unexpected, and actually better. And then you be better. Like Josh said, this is not our default here. Let's be better in this circumstance as much as we can possibly do so. The idea of do not retaliate. Retaliation for perceived or actual wrong is a very human response. Honestly, that's like the natural go-to, isn't it? Somebody pops you and slaps you in the face, it's like, is there a ball bat nearby that I can kind of level the playing field? That's kind of where we want to go to. It's part of our culture, and it's in many of our stories. And who doesn't love a good action flick? Where we get down to the end of it and it's payback time. That kind of a thing. Let me give you another example. Have you ever gotten into an argument with somebody else? And the answer is yes. But in the argument that you got into, you want the last word in the argument. We're arguing, we're debating, whatever it is, we want the last word. Why do we want the last word?
Pride.
Say what?
Pride.
Yeah, pride could be a motivating factor.
We want to be right.
We want to win, right? We want to win the argument. Whoever speaks last in the argument or the debate, that's the winner. That's also, in part because we typically remember the first thing that was said in the argument and the last thing that was said in the argument. We want that to be us. I want to win the argument, so I want to say the last thing. And it doesn't matter whether I won the argument because of my keen intellect or my rapier-like debating skills or the righteousness of my cause, or simply because I was too stubborn to quit. I won because I had the last word. That's a form of retaliation. Now, there's certain people that I have had to work with, or a couple brothers in the church and another congregation and things like that. I didn't want to engage them in any discussion whatsoever because it was going to get twisted up into some form of debate or some form of argument, and they weren't going to shut up until they got the last word. So better not to have the conversation at all. But that's a form of retaliation, and that's not what we're supposed to do. Romans 12, 17 through 19. Never pay back evil for evil to anyone. Respect what is right in the sight of all men. If possible, so far as it depends on you, Be at peace with all men. Never take your own revenge, beloved, but leave room for the wrath of God. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. So rule number one, don't repay evil with evil. That kind of violates human nature. At least it violates my human nature, or did at one time. If possible, so far as it depends on you. Does it always depend on you? No, war is a relationship. Conflict is a relationship. You don't be the one that instigates it and maintains it. Be at peace with all men. And then this idea, who takes vengeance? God does. Does that necessarily mean that you and I will see the vengeance that God takes over that situation? No, it does not. But the thing about God taking vengeance is he knows the situation. You and I see it from one perspective of what you did to me or I did to you. God's able to weigh the cause, the effect, and everything at stake, and then do an appropriate level of punitive action on this. So he can judge this thing in ways that you and I simply can't do it, and so he'll take care of it.
Yeah, this verse has really always been tough for me, because when I look at someone who purposely kills someone, how I've always viewed it is that if you take someone's life, your life should be forfeited, right? Because if life is of that value and you have that such disregard for it, your life should be forfeited. But it's tough because when it's not forfeited, you also have an opportunity to become a Christian and bring your life back to God. And so it's always a really tough thing of there could be an opportunity for growth and then restoration, or you just lose your life because you did not have the dignity to respect life and you took it. And so this has always been tough because I've always felt that in any society, that's how, to me, a society would respect the dignity of life, not only through Christian values, but if you take a life, yours is forfeited.
Yeah, I understand that, and I've thought long and hard about that and reached kind of the same conclusion of it. Life should be sacred, but if you take the life of the individual who did the murdering, then they have no chance to repent, and there's eternity at stake there. The Old Testament law does codify a lot of things that that were punishable by death, but even under the law of Moses, they didn't always punish by death in these circumstances. There was a little bit of mercy in there. And then the other thing, to keep in mind is even if that penalty doesn't get implemented there, we don't, execute the murderer, there's a temporal punishment that will bear for the rest of their life. Try putting on your resume, I was convicted of a first-degree murder, and spent 25 years in prison there. That's generally not a winning bullet point on your resume. People will remember it. Other people who are associated with you, your family and all of these other people may remember that, and it's not going to go away. But eternity is still yours, can be yours, yes.
I think there's another practical side to this. The vengeance you want to take may not be right at all. You may think you're right and not. God is always right.
Yeah.
I mean, you can think you're the good guy, you're the just guy, you've been persecuted, and you want your revenge. But you may be wrong in that. You may be the one who was the persecutor. You understand what I mean?
Yeah. Our perspective isn't his perspective. Yeah.
Right, very human side of this.
Yeah, we can only act on the evidence that's presented before us there. And God sees all the other evidence that we don't.
How do we take that evidence? How do we view it?
Yeah. Usually in some way that favors us. So.
Yes.
Okay. A lack of retaliation does confuse the humiliator, particularly when we're dealing with the things that we talked about early in the chapter, the slapping of the cheek and things like that. But it does reflect Christ's attitude towards his persecutors. He never went out and sought persecution, but he never avoided it. Or he did avoid it because he didn't want it to be implemented or come to fruit until he was ready for it to. But that wasn't his goal here, was to get everybody to persecute him and his followers. His goal was to seek and save the lost. This was a side effect of it. because he saw, beyond the incident to their eternal needs. That's his viewpoint on this. And God will avenge the wrong. If there's justice, the scales of justice will be balanced, and God's going to take care of it. And that's the clear teaching in Romans 12. So, getting our feelings under control. This is one of those things that, there's a passage in Hebrews, which I got up here, Hebrews 12:15. See to it that no one comes short of the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springing up causes trouble, and by it many may be defiled. It does hurt to be mistreated and humiliated, but it doesn't get any better if we dwell on it. I've thought about doing this as a thought exercise, but go back in my memory and think of the first person who did something wrong to me, and the next person that did something wrong to me, and the next person, and the next person, and the next person, across soon to be 7 decades of life there. I don't know how long it would take me to do that. I do know what I would feel at the end of that exercise. I don't, hostility, anger, this world, life sucks and everybody's been mean to me and cruel to me and things like that. What comes out of that? That verse right there. That's the root of bitterness. And if I did that, it would be because I deliberately planted the seed for it. Might be more useful sometime to write the list down and then just burn it and let it go. I'm not sure I could actually do that either, but the idea of keeping and looking back on these things and holding the grudge and nursing the things, stuff like that, you're not going to wind up in a good place. Ricky?
I don't think I place it. I think Satan places it, because I go through the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like mental gymnastics, but it's like Satan's going in there. Yeah, don't you remember 1982 when so-and-so did this to you? And I'm trying to fight that out of my system, but it's like Satan is kind of doing that, I think, for me.
Yeah. Not going to wind up in a good place with it. You got to let it go. And because it's going to start out as a root, but then it's going to grow and it's going to produce fruit. And when you've got fruit, then you know what it really is. And it's going to be trouble. Yes, Morgan?
We actually talked about this in a different context today, but Philippians 4:8, whatever is true, honorable, just, pure, those things, that doesn't fall under that list.
Yeah.
And there's lots of other things, that we can kind of fill our minds with.
Yeah.
But I really think some of these, the bitterness and things that you let take root will color a lot of what you dwell on.
Well, and thinking on the things you should will color a lot.
Yeah.
And, it is. And both of these are a choice, aren't they? Do you want to pick the bitter parts, or do you want to pick the good parts, the just parts, the righteous parts, the parts that bring us actual joy? You're going to get to pick one or the other, and there will be a fruit that's born of it. That's absolutely correct. Okay. Persecution will happen. Jesus said that it would. Don't believe me? John 15:20-21. Remember that the word that I said to you, a slave is no greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. If they kept my word, they will keep yours also. But all these things they will do to you for my name's sake, because they do not know the one who sent me. You've probably experienced some form of persecution more along the lines of ridicule and marginalization or something like that, or some snide remark or something like that. That's the slap on the cheek part. How did you handle it? Blessed are those who have been persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. This is a little earlier in the Sermon on the Mount than our theme passage tonight. Blessed are you when men cast insults at you and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely on account of me. Verse 11, that hurts. That affects your self-image. That might affect your income, your ability to have relationships with other people and all kinds of things, what they're doing there. He says in verse 12, rejoice and be glad, for your reward in heaven is great, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Kind of joining in the stream crowd that maybe you didn't really want to, but they didn't want to either. I did want to touch base on this idea. If you have been harmed by someone else, you have the right to pursue legal action, both criminal and or civil. There are laws coded in the state of Ohio laws, federal laws, and things like that say that you cannot treat people in certain ways. Government is authorized by God and exists for the protection of all. If you go back and look at Romans 13, 1 through 7, which if I'd have known I was going to get a little extra time tonight, we'd have just read it all out. Look at there and see how much of that passage is Paul telling them, this is what government's supposed to do. It's supposed to uphold the good. It's supposed to punish the bad. It does not wield the sword in vain. It's supposed to judge these things because God appointed it to do that. That is an option in those situations. You do not have to take those other things. Christ is not talking about taking those things and just saying, well, maybe I'll just act like it didn't happen. No, he's talking about the smaller things in Matthew chapter 5. This is something that you have the right to do, and if it's necessary, you should do it. And you do it without guilt. Questions or comments? Okay, let's summarize here a little bit, and I got one more passage. Nobody likes being humiliated or victimized by others. Not fun. If we did like it, there would be something wrong with us. You know, there's some real self-image things if you're really going out and seek people to treat you poorly and treat you badly. As Christians, we have the responsibility to respond the way that Christ would respond. Turning the other cheek is a way to exert control over an unpleasant act by someone else. And in the event of serious harm, we do have the right to seek legal action. So we're going to learn new behaviors. If we haven't learned them, this is what we're going to do, is we're going to learn some new behaviors that are going to bless us and bless others in the long run. But it might not be easy for some of us to learn. So, final closing passage here. 1 Peter chapter 2, 21 through 23. For you have been called for this purpose, since Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example for you to follow in his steps, who committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in his mouth, and while being reviled, he did not revile in return. While suffering, he uttered no threats, but kept entrusting himself to him who judges righteously. That's what he did. That's what we're called to do. So, not necessarily going to be easy. And part of the reason that we want to have the relationship with each other is when this doesn't get easy, that you've got somebody to turn to for some strength, for some support, for some comfort. So, anything else? Well, thank you for your attention and comments, and we'll find another topic to study next week.
That's it.
That's it.